Hello everyone. Thank you so very much for coming today. My name is Dr. Peter Chen and I'm a lecturer in Media and Politics in the Department of Governments and International Relations here at the University of Sydney. I'm not obviously the person you've come to see. I am delighted to welcome three excellent panellists for our discussion today, who are all people whose work I read and have read and admired. The first speaker obviously is Emeritus Professor Rod Tiffen, who is here at the University of Sydney. He is one of Australia's leading scholars in the area of the study of media. He has extremely distinguished teaching and research history, author of a wide variety of books, not just on the media and politics, but also on East Timor and corruption issues, scandals and the like. And was the author of the first academic book I ever read on media politics, News and Power. And so, as an undergraduate student, had a big impact on where I happen to be today. Our second guest speaker is Professor Wendy Bacon, who's joined us from the University of Technology, Sydney, and is based in the Centre for Independent Journalism, so obviously has a keen interest in this topic. And is well known to many of you both through her professional practice work as an investigative journalist and winner of Walkley Feature Writing Award, but probably most recently students of the study of media politics will be very familiar with the work she did in conjunction with a group of students and Crikey, looking at the way in which public relations material is increasingly being used to pad out and create stories in newspapers. The final speaker we have today is Mr. Peter Timmins, who's a lawyer, an author, commentator and consultant in the area of FOI policy and privacy. He has a very distinguished professional background in the area of law, but also in government and diplomatic service. And he's the author of an excellent blog called FOI-privacy.blogspot.com. Which is my go-to source of current information, considered views on evolving debates and discussions, policy making in the area of Freedom of Information Act in Australia and also privacy issues. So what we're going to do today with these three excellent speakers is they've agreed to give 10 to 15 minutes of commentary in advance in order, and then we'll have half of the time, about 45 minutes left, for questions from the audience. So without further ado, I invite Rod Tiffen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. I must say I'm always very tickled to hear myself described as one of Australia's leading media scholars. About, 10 or 15 years ago, when they were doing the websites for the staff members around the university, everyone got quite a neutral description, but for some reason, whoever wrote it called me one of Australia's leading media scholars. I didn't complain, and it must number now in dozens or hundreds of times that I've been introduced that way. So I think there's a lesson there for you PR people or whatever about these things. But thank you for saying that. Now, there's an old saying in politics, never hold an inquiry unless you know the result. The equivalent for a media inquiry is you only hold it if you are confident there will be no substantial result. And when the inquiry was announced that very day, many of the articles about the inquiry were written more or less as obituaries about what it would fail to do. And there's a journalistic consensus usually on media inquiries that nothing good will come of them, but something bad might. This is a sort of common reaction amongst all professions when some external light is shone upon them. But and the something bad that might happen is that there will be more government involvement than already exists. Now, they often put this in a very totalistic way that overlooks the degree of government involvement that already exists. For example, we have laws of defamation and contempt of court, and some laws regarding national security and so forth. So there's a degree of media hypocrisy about this. And speaking of media hypocrisy, immediately brings us to the topic of Andrew Bolt. And you'll remember there were huge cries about freedom of the press a couple of weeks ago when, under the Racial Discrimination Act, his work in the Herald Sun was found to have been guilty of breaching the Act. To me, the interesting thing about that was most of those defendants, because of the palpable errors and malevolent errors in Bolt's work, could have sued for defamation. And if they successfully sued for defamation, which most of them would have, it would have cost the Herald Sun maybe $1 million or more. And no one would have cried, freedom of press is at stake. But because it was under this new act, suddenly it was a threat to democracy. I couldn't see, I'm not actually necessarily a huge fan of racial discrimination acts, but I couldn't see that in this case, the idea that there was a threat to freedom of speech for someone to completely wrongly impugn people, that there was a big issue of principle here. Anyway, and I think the other thing when we're thinking about freedom of speech in this context is the next day Andrew Bolt got the whole of the front page of the Herald Sun to himself for his case, and I'm just wondering how often any of the 9 people he had attacked have ever been quoted directly on the front page of the Herald Sun. And perhaps there is a freedom of speech issue there as well. So the most obvious aspect of the beginning of the inquiry is the low expectations that surround it. Partly, because I'm the first speaker, I might just go a little into the history of how it was born. The Greens, because of the completely unfair coverage of them by the Murdoch press, have been the keenest to have the inquiry. The government was reluctant to have it. The opposition was strongly opposed to having it. And the opportunity opened because of the outrageous behaviour of Murdoch's News of the World newspaper in London. And many of you will be familiar with its most egregious offence when it tapped and meddled with the mobile phone of teenage murder victim Millie Dowler. And then followed the revelation that it had been conducting phone tapping and email hacking on an industrial scale, and that many of its key people have been lying about it. This produced an understandable reaction against the Murdoch press in America, in Australia, and in Britain. I doubt that we have such offences by the Murdoch press here, or even in America, but they are perhaps the most ethically challenged of all major media corporations. So there's a lot of public anger and discontent with the media, but an inquiry like this can only address fairly peripheral and partial aspects of it. And this is because it's very hard to set public policy, enforceable public policy about news media behaviour. You can't just make a law that says the media will produce serious, high-quality news. It's not an enforceable law, and so forth. And journalists have a well-founded, here I'm more on the side of the journalists have a well-founded suspicion that judges and politicians don't understand or appreciate their role. Some of the democratic value of the media arises from its pursuit of trivia, of politicians not filling in their expenses page properly or whatever. And there was a nice book written by an American colleague, Michael Schudson, called Why Democracies Need an Unlovable Press. So it's not just the press at its most noble that helps democracy, it's also the press at its mundane, at its petty, sometimes even at its vindictive. But that doesn't mean that everything they do helps democracy by any means. And I think there is a hope in this inquiry for some small improvements, not no improvements. I want to talk about two other things tonight. I haven't timed my talk, but I'm sure Peter will cut me off in his usual ruthless way if I go over time. The second is we have a huge problem of concentration in Australian media. Some figures that I've been compiling in a research project I've been doing, that the most dominant country in Australia, New Zealand, accounts for 58% of paid daily circulation. That's in all daily newspapers through the country, provincial as well as metropolitan. The next highest figure in any of the 27 countries on which we have data is 44% in Ireland and Australia. The two top companies in Australia, News and Fairfax, together comprise 86% of daily circulation. And the next highest figure, which is very high, is in Portugal, 77%. But in contrast, in the United States, that figure is 14%. And in many other countries, it's less than 30%. And the top four companies, News, Fairfax, Western Australian newspapers, and the IPN, the O'Reilly Group, account for 99% of paid daily circulation in Australia. I think that's actually 99.3 or something like that percent. And a couple of other countries get close to it. But we have the most concentrated press ownership in the democratic world. And I don't think anyone can pretend that is not a problem for the quality of Australian democracy. The problem is, what do you do about it? And the problem is even greater because how do you tackle concentration in an industry which is in serious decline? If newspapers were a growing industry, it might be easier to introduce diversity. But they're a shrinking industry. Many of you will know this. There was a famous prediction by Philip Mayer about the future of the American newspaper, which rather concretely prophesied the last American daily newspaper will disappear in the spring of 2042, I think it was. And there's a lot of doomsayers, well-researched doomsayers about what are the future of newspapers. So the key problem facing this inquiry is really, if they wanted to introduce more diversity, how to go about it. And that is much easier, that question is much more easily posed than answered, given the problems of the Australian press. And the third thing or the last thing that I will look at very briefly is, it seems to me the biggest hope for short-term tangible change is in improving the means of redress for people with grievances about how they're covered in the news. Now, our current bodies for doing this are based on obsolete distinctions. Many of them, like the Press Council, are medium-specific. So I think that it's time to move to something like a News and Information Council that is not medium-specific, but deals with all factual comment wherever it appears. And in my view, there should be a primary emphasis here, as in the Press Council, that individuals are able to gain redress, and the onus of proof is against the media if those individuals are not seeking financial gain, but merely seeking correction or the putting of their view more fairly. On the other hand, there will be individuals seeking a financial penalty from the media, and in that case, I think the onus of proof should be on the complainants to show that there was malicious or reckless or whatever behaviour by the news organisation involved. I just finished with one very minor example involving myself here. A few years ago, I was attacked by Peter Zackerman. It was at the time of the New South Wales election before last, where he was heroically trying to argue that New South Wales Liberals' prospects had improved because they got rid of John Brogden and appointed Peter Devlin as leader. All the evidence was, of course, in the other direction. And in fact, if John Brogden, despite him being so hopeless, would just come out and publicly support Devlin, the New South Wales Liberals would probably win. And in fact, there was a myth around that the Liberal Party helped get rid of Brogden. And I had written about this, and he quoted me twice in the article to say there's no proof, there was no proof that the Liberal Party had helped get rid of Brogden. And he quoted two sentences from Daily Telegraph editorial executives. In fact, he quoted the first half of each sentence and then omitted the second half, which said that it was actually a Daily Telegraph editorial executive that had said the first half. So I thought this was a rather strange form of dyslexia myself, how you could only understand the bits of the sentence that agreed with the case you were putting, but were blind to the bits that actually completely falsified it. Now, I went through several attempts, 3 or 4 phone calls to the Daily Telegraph, none of which were answered. I think it's their policy that phone line is never answered. I sent several emails and I was completely ignored. I was tickled a few years later to see an article in the Telegraph saying the ABC had to improve its complaints procedure because it seems to me the Telegraphs were simply non-existent. It's that easy form of redress where someone has been misrepresented. There should be more citizen access and easy citizen access, cheap, quick citizen access to seeking those sorts of needs of redress. And I think that's the area where this inquiry is most likely to produce a short-term substantial improvement. And of course, we'll be happy to answer questions later. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me here today to talk about the media inquiry. It's great to see so many people here, and if you're taking an interest in this and whether you get ideas today or you've already got them, I really encourage you to engage with this process and to make some sort of submission yourself or with any group that you're a part of to the inquiry. And if anything I say today sparks your interest and you think I might have more information, well, please email me. Look, I agree with a lot of what Rod has said, actually, and so I'm not going to go over the same ground that he has. And in particular, of course, when the media inquiry in terms of reference were announced, there was, amongst those who hoped for an inquiry that could be meaningful, there was a lot of disappointment about the fact that media ownership was not put on the agenda at all. Of course, as Rod says, in the society in which we live, at this particular moment in journalism, it's a very tough one to tackle, but nevertheless, we're almost, we're certainly for a long time been one of the most concentrated medias in the Western world, at least, and it needs to be put on the record again and again what a problem it is, and I'll come back to that. Now, I want to draw your attention to something that has come out in the first issues paper put out by the media inquiry. It's a very slim issues paper indeed, and I think, to some extent disappointing from that point of view. But one thing really caught my eye, and that is that Justice Finkelstein, who's the chair of this inquiry, has asked a question. And I'm sure that a number of you are politics or humanities students, and or even if you're not, you might be science students, you may have thought about this question. And what they have asked is to think about notions of free press or free media, and to think about different conceptions of that. And they've asked a question. They've actually quoted a previous US Supreme Court Judge, Holmes, a dissenting judgment in a particular case. And they've said, is the ultimate good desired, the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas. That the test of truth is the power of thought to get accepted in the competition of the marketplace. Now that is, then they ask, well, do we agree with that? Is that the only conception of freedom of speech? Are there other ones that might relate more, for example, to access to a communication? Now I think it's interesting they've asked this question, and I think as many of us as possible, particularly academics and students, because we engage with these sort of ideas on a regular basis, should put it right back to them that there is indeed other conceptions of freedom of speech. And in some ways, if we let this opportunity go by and we don't get it recorded in this report, that there are other notions, I think we really will have let ourselves and everyone else down. And if we put it back strongly enough, they will have to take it on board in their report. Now, of course, John Keane in this university has long ago written very good essays about liberty of the press, pointing out that right from the very beginning in the notion of truth-outing in the marketplace of ideas, there always were contradictions. Like in the beginning, for example, women weren't even part of it. Today, you could argue certain sections of the community aren't really part of the free marketplace of ideas either. But there's been some other very good ideas put forward by a person called Fred Schau, who was a professor of the First Amendment at Harvard University. He came out to Australia in the early 90s and argued very strongly in response to some High Court judgments in Australia that we should be taking into account private power in contemporary times, as well as the old sort of free press notion, which was always the individual against the state. Now, I'm not going to go more into this here, other than to say that there are other conceptions of freedom of communication, very particularly around addressing access rather than simply the power of the press to speak. It's a very old saying, that if you're an owner, that's fine. You've certainly got the right to say what you want. And there's a lot to be said about that. So it's interesting that the word democracy is not mentioned there, and the whole literature on media and democracy and the rights and responsibilities that it imposes on the media, the importance of the media having the freedom to scrutinise and be a watchdog on power, most certainly needs to be protected. Even if privacy is going to be protected, I'm a very strong believer in there being strong public interest caveats there and defences there, but nevertheless, the media is not just anybody out there. It does exercise power. And I have no problem at all with Andrew Bolt saying anything he likes standing in the street, but I do have a problem with him having the sort of power he's got in the Australian media today, and I'm going to mention something more about that, to trample on the rights and reputations of others. And it's enormously heartening, I think, today to see in the judgment in the Bolt racial discrimination case that the remedy is going to be a double page, at least as much space as Andrew Bolt exercised in trouncing on the reputations of those Aboriginal people, that they are going to get a correction. And that is one of the things I think, and I agree with Rod there, that if we can't do much about the concentration of ownership thing, we should really be looking for remedies that can to some extent give some real redress. And complaining to the Press Council is not, in my view, usually a very good means of getting redress, because even if you get a finding in your favour after a long time, it will be in the paper probably, but not very prominently. Now, I think it is important to take on board the history of these inquiries, and I'd like to tell you that there's been several, but one of them was the Norris inquiry in Victoria in 1981, another one was the Lee inquiry in 1991, and both of those found that there was a concentration of media power in Australia to a worrying degree, and it was possible for there to be abuses of power. Now, in the Lee inquiry, they stopped short. They did investigate it. There was a division, but they stopped short of actually finding that those abuses of power were being committed, and I think there's a lot more evidence to demonstrate now than there was then. I think that it's very important to look very critically at the way, particularly News Limited, are preparing for this inquiry and defending themselves against any intrusion on their power. It's worth knowing, if you go right back to 1975, how much longer have I got? Peter, my phone? If you go back to 1975, it was then the, might have been before that, but it was then the Whitlam government, and the minister in that government, Moss Cass, dared to suggest that there should be some form of media regulation, not of a censorship kind. He wasn't actually talking about that, but he suggested that one of his options was there should be a press council. And he was absolutely trounced on and demolished in the media, but due to a number of events, eventually the media owners did agree to a press council. But at every point in our history, they have always argued that anything that might in any way be a parameter around it, whether it was the cross-media ownership laws, whatever it was, they've always said that that would interfere with their free speech, and somehow their free speech survived. So I think that a critical look at that. I also think that there's going to be a lot said. I've already picked up this so far. Rod's given you some very important information about the concentration of the media. What's going to be said in response to that? Oh, it's all happening out there on the internet. There's so much diversity. Now, of course there is, and we actually are in a better situation than the 1990s. You can access online journalism in places like New Matilda, Crikey, but really there is very few outlets. There's also some very fine blogs, critiquing climate skepticism, for example, some probably very fine film reviewing, but journalism does take resources. And I would suggest, when we're really talking about the reporting of news and current affairs, there is still relatively little outside the mainstream media. And much that's in blogs actually picks up on the mainstream media and repeats it and comments on it. To actually get the information does take time and does take resource. I think another thing that needs to happen is that the inquiry needs to look at some international models, and in particular look to Scandinavia, where, of course, there is much stronger constitutional protection for freedom of expression in Scandinavia, but there is a much stronger compact built into their whole political system about accountability of the media, freedom of the media, protection actually of privacy, probably to a higher extent than we have here, but also partly diversity is being maintained through subsidies to non-mainstream, particularly rural areas. And I'd like to pick that up because I would like to support some public subsidy of sort of more diverse media outside the mainstream. But I don't particularly think that that should go to elite organisations or organisations that already serve people who are very well served for information. I think that where the real problem comes is in the regional and rural areas of Australia where there's been a continuing depletion of news and current affairs sources. And I thought I might just tell you briefly about some research I've been doing. This has not been published yet, but will be shortly. But can I tell you that if you were to examine how this year climate science, I'm talking now about climate science is being covered in our media, you will find that across newspapers in Australia, mainstream newspapers, that more space has been given to the comment pieces by climate skeptics, including Andrew Bolt particularly, and Christopher Pearce and others, more space, more words, than the entire news and features relying on peer-reviewed science. Now, I'm not saying the entire news and features on climate science, but I'm saying if you take a measure of the coverage linking back to the science, which has been peer-reviewed, compare that to skepticism in his own world. What does that mean in a paper like the New Northern Territory News, the only paper in Darwin, admittedly fairly small circulation? It means that over 3 months you would have got maybe 5 or 6 very maybe less than that, very small pieces, mostly less than 100 words, coming in from the wires, popped in the paper, some sort of finding on climate science, you would have got very big, heavily promoted pieces, 2 of them from Andrew Bolt and one even longer from one of the Liberal Party skeptics. Now, if you're sitting in Darwin, what you're getting is misinformation delivered, and actually I care less about Andrew Bolt than I think the questions that really need to be asked in this inquiry is who and why do the editors of View, which ones, and is it right at the top, or is it the individual editors who decide that it is appropriate to promote Andrew Bolt across double pages of the paper on a bi-weekly basis with tags to MTR Radio, which is also promoting climate skepticism, and Channel 10. This is commerce, it is delivery of information for profit. It is not actually about individuals. One other point, if I've got time, Peter, I'd like to, 2 minutes yet. Cut off or 2 minutes? Cut off.
2.
Okay. Can I make one other point? That's coming through in the media that, okay, journalists are supposed to deliver factual reporting. And what that really means is that nobody, we all realise that, social production of news is what happens. The notion of truth is a constructed one. However, we are meant to attempt factual reporting, and professional journalists usually do their best to do that, nearly always. Now, there is a thing called comment, that's opinion pieces. But in my whole experience of journalism, comment pieces are supposed to be based on facts as accurately stated as possible. Now, just recently, in the last 4 months, there has kind of arisen an idea out there that somehow comment pieces are completely different from news, and you can just say what you like about anybody without actually submitting that to the same test as you do other information. And there is a question for the inquiry is, do you just separate fact from comment? Well, I think you don't. I think if we want to have serious standards in professional journalism, that all reporting, of course comment, the comment should be free, but it should be based on facts that are not recklessly stated, not stated out of context, as in my studies I can show that they were in climate science commenting, but actually present arguments based on facts stated as accurately as possible. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully some other things will come up in discussion. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. And our final speaker is...
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. A newsflash, could it come to this? The National Media and Communications Authority has today announced fines on private newspapers, websites, broadcasters and other content providers that have violated press rules on balanced coverage, as well as immoral reporting such as content involving sex, violence and alcohol. Fines could be as much as $934,000 for radio and television stations, $120,000 for daily newspapers and online news outlets, and approximately $47,000 for weeklies. Outlets could also be suspended or shut down. The new law, in essence, subjects private media organisations to the rules and regulations that govern public and state-run media and imposes potentially severe penalties for content-related violations. Well, I don't think it is going to come to that, but it has come to that in Hungary, where a law was passed last December and came into effect in January this year, which does give state control of the media and power to shut down, to fine, for so-called unbalanced reporting. I don't think there's any hope that we're going to see anything like that in Australia, but we do have a very interesting media inquiry. Professor Tiffen mentioned that the backdrop, of course, was that the News Limited media had declared war on the Greens. We must have let this party destroy the country. I guess you could also say it declared war on the government over the last 12 months or so as well. But there's a lot of other things that have come together around this time that really has raised enormous interest in how the media operates. I mean, we've got the technological change that Professor Baker mentioned. We've got changes in the media, moving from traditional fourth estate, cornerstone of democracy ideas, to market-driven commercial interests, where the media, in some respects, has a clear agenda. Stories are tailored to meet that agenda. In some cases, at least, the storyline comes first, followed by the collection of facts to support it. It doesn't sound very much like traditional journalism or fourth estate principles. The media's gone into infotainment big time. So celebrity and fame, attending rumour, gossip, straight fiction often means that many in the spotlight are subject to those sorts of stories. We've seen the rise and rise and rise of opinion and the blurring of fact and comment. And of course we've got some media organisations that assert the power to make and unmake governments. So it's a rather different media landscape, I think, that we've got these days than what might have been there traditionally. There's a lot of silly things being said during the course of the discussion about these issues. So democracy is dead. Say the protesters taking their right to protest in Parliament House just a couple of weeks ago. Democracy is dead. I don't think it is. The Herald Sun had a headline in the last week: the media inquiry aligns us more to Fiji than true democracy. I'm struggling a bit with that. We've had other things like freedom of speech is dead in Australia. With some people, Paul Kelly, for example, in a long piece in the Weekend Australia, says that Tony Abbott's been given a gift because the Labor government is determined to stop political debate and the valid expression of view by the Australian people. I'm really struggling with that. So, while there's room for debate about a lot of these issues and differences of opinion about where to draw the line, a lot of the arguments that have been run up in some media quarters are that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of expression is absolute. It mustn't be hemmed in by any sort of law. And I think in the media inquiry context, we're going to have a rather interesting debate about some of these issues. Let me make 3 points about the inquiry. First of all, media industry leaders and leaders of the journalism profession should have seen the signs years ago that there was a need to take a look at getting the house in order in terms of standards, values and observance of ethics. I think they didn't do that, and they preferred to stand tall wearing the cloak of the fourth estate while seeing off any criticism about the way the media operated. I think the second point to make is the inquiry hopefully will put what happens in media organisations under the microscope and identify how and in what way they should lift their self-regulatory regime. The inquiry will also look into the business model that has supported quality journalism and production of news. Point B in the terms of reference on the screen. I think it's interesting that this business model, of course, is struggling, as we heard from the previous speakers, is struggling to gain oxygen and survive. But the inquiry is to look at how such activities can be supported and diversity enhanced. That might just mean that it could turn out to be more friend than foe in looking at the opportunity to support and enhance diversity in the media context. I think the final point I make about the inquiry, I'll come back to it in a moment, is that privacy and the clash of privacy and other public interest considerations is a clear part of this inquiry, because those are issues that form part of codes of practice under which journalists operate, and I think we're going to have a very lively debate about that issue. On the inquiry itself, I think the issues paper was a pretty unimaginative way to start to try to generate discussion. It's a whole series of questions. In fact, you could call it a skeleton full of questions with not much else hanging on the bones. Some of the questions are quite silly. As Jonathan Holmes has pointed out on the drum recently, the word appropriate gets used as if it's the DNA of the skeleton. And so we have questions like, is it appropriate, especially in the search for truth on political issues, that persons holding opposing views have an opportunity to express their views in the media? Is it appropriate? I'm not too sure people will be arguing against it. Another one, if a substantial attack is made on the honesty, character, integrity or personal qualities of a person or group, is it appropriate for the person or group to have the opportunity to respond? Well, I guess we all say yes. So those words hang there, but there are other important questions that are raised. One of it is, of course, is it appropriate that media outlets and journalists conform to standards of conduct and codes of practice? I don't imagine there'll be many negative submissions on that one. So, coming back to my first point, that the media organisations haven't really picked up on the fact that their own standards, values, ethics, practices really should be looked at. I mean, for years people have been writing about this and drawing attention to it. Just one example. Dr. Dennis Muller, now the Director of the Centre for Advanced Journalism at the University of Melbourne, in a 2005 thesis that you can find on the web, Media Accountability and Liberal Democracy, and drawing on 27 years of journalism experience himself, said, and I quote, "Media codes of practice and ethics all espouse honesty, integrity, fairness, accuracy, impartiality, promotion of a free press, and correction of material errors. They also exhibit substantial gaps because they have insufficient focus on practice." He goes on to say this is an unsatisfactory state of affairs, and he describes media accountability through these systems as fragmented, Byzantine in its complexity, lacking transparency in its operations, inherently biased towards the interests of journalists and publishers, and lacking credibility. I could go on. Margaret Simons has written about this in The Content Makers. David Soul has written about it in The Media We Deserve. And on you could go. So all of this, we had media leaders and journalist leaders saying things are pretty good. We don't need to pay much attention to these criticisms. And what we had more recently, I guess, is a lot of media-owned goals, particularly in the area of not dealing properly with privacy issues, that mean a whole lot of new questions and concerns have been raised about the extent to which self-regulation works. Sunny Williams and Candice Falzon, caught in flagrante in a toilet booth in a hotel in Clovelly. I guess we're going about their business, so to speak. But when someone put a recording camera under the door and sold that to the Daily Telegraph and put it online, the response of the editor of the Telegraph at the time, David Penderty, was that it was of great interest to the public because it scored more hits than any other item they put on their website at any time. Lara Bingle in the shower, courtesy of Brendan Favola. I guess that also raised some interesting issues when it was picked up and published widely in Women's Day and other magazines. We had the unidentified woman in the Hanson photos. It didn't turn out to be Pauline. But the only apology that was offered by the then editor of the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, was that they were sorry it wasn't Pauline. So I presume that if it was Pauline, it still would have been seen to be in the public interest. Published photographs of two people in a motel room 30 years ago, which appeared to have nothing to do with their public life. So I think privacy is going to be an issue in the Finkelstein inquiry. And just on Judge Finkelstein, I've talked to some people, I don't know him personally, but I've had people tell me that you don't really know what you're going to get with someone like Judge Finkelstein. So coming back to Professor Tiffen's point that you usually set up an inquiry and you know the outcome, I think there might be some people who are suggesting this is a perhaps interesting and perhaps courageous choice that we may see some interesting developments. About time? Am I going? So coming back to the privacy issue just briefly, the Australian Press Council, the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance have statements about values, practices, principles. They generally address the privacy issue by saying that while privacy must be respected, there is a need to balance that against public interest considerations. I mean, for example, the Australian Press Council standards talk about journalists should not unduly intrude on the privacy of individuals and should show respect for the dignity and sensitivity of people encountered in the course of gathering news. That sounds great. Members of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance are urged to respect private grief and personal privacy. These systems, however, I think have been described as toothless tigers, and some suggest that's even putting it mildly. Of course, the Press Council used to be called the publisher's poodle, and there are some signs of change there. There are now a majority of members of the Press Council who are not connected with media organisations, and a rather interesting, relatively new head of the Press Council, who's been very positive about the establishment of this inquiry. I guess given the terms of reference, number C, you might see why. That one of the terms of reference is to explore ways of substantially strengthening the independence and effectiveness of the Australian Press Council, including in relation to online publications, and with particular reference to the handling of complaints. The reason why privacy is important in this debate is that media organisations in the conduct of journalism are exempt from the Privacy Act in this country. Every other organisation, private organisation, public sector organisation, but private organisation with a turnover of more than $3 million a year is subject to the Privacy Act. Media organisations in the conduct of journalism aren't if they subscribe to some principles that indicate they will appropriately protect privacy. We've had an Australian Law Reform Commission report for the last 3 years which has pointed out that that really isn't strong enough in terms of how the media should work to respect privacy. And they've made recommendations about ways in which the adequacy of those standards might be looked at. It's not simply that they sign up to the Press Council standards. Someone should sign off that those standards are adequate in some way. And it makes a number of other recommendations as well about change. There hasn't been much debate about that. Some of the media in the last couple of weeks has been absorbed by the separate possibility that the government's flagged in another issues paper that there should be a statutory cause of action for a serious invasion of privacy. This has led some newspapers to a series of articles which have had headlines, for example, "The privacy tort is a hate-filled smear against democracy." Another memorable headline in the same publication, it is The Australian, and it's in the legal affairs section of The Australian, where the editor, Chris Merritt, I think has been Chicken Little personified. But the other classic headline was that this privacy tort, the headline was, "Privacy Plan, Journos Face Jail." There are also connections with a drop in Australian productivity, and I've been waiting for a connection to be made between the carbon tax and the cause of action for a serious invasion of privacy. I'm sure it's going to come in time. In any event, Peter, I'm sure I'm just about done on time. I think the media inquiry will be a very interesting debate. I hope we do get out of it a closer look at what happens in media organisations. And I hope we have a pretty lively debate about some of the issues I've flagged today. For example, privacy, how well the media respects it, and how we balance privacy and other public interests. Thank you.
Well, I know when we're at the next one, I'm going to not invite the rest of you so that I can just sit down with the speakers because I have hours worth of questions for them. I'll invite the speakers just to join us out the front here, and I'm just going to give them a little bit of a microphone for questions. Just by way of question etiquette, I think I'll direct questions. Because Peter has just spoken, maybe if your questions for Peter, you could wait till a couple of preceding speakers get questioned first. And just when you ask your question, if I can request just that you give your name and any relevant affiliation. Just, we know who the speakers are, I'm sure they'd like to know who you are. So, thank you. And can I just put this in the centre? Okay?
Yeah.
I have a microphone.
So we're sharing this one.
Sure. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, our first.
Hello, my name is Tim Dwyer. I'm from the University Sydney Media Department. Thank you very much to the panellists for their very informative discussions, and hopefully they'll help us with our submissions to the media inquiry. One of the questions that I'm trying to tease out myself in doing a submission is the question about serious breaches by the media, and why should the press be treated differently to the rest of the electronic estate? So I just wondered whether our panellists might comment on that or share their thoughts about, why it is that the press is fundamentally different from broadcasting or other areas of electronic media, including online media.
Thanks, Tim. I actually think that time for that has passed. It used to be the case and it still is to a large degree the case in television news, that there is a practice of getting both sides on many stories. On commercial talk radio, for example, that would be a rarity. Their presentations were overwhelmingly one-sided. It seems to me that, and the ABC, of course, has the most developed complaints procedures in the country by a long, long way. And it seems to me that it's time for an equal playing field here between organisations, between media, and so forth. And that's why I think something, whatever it's to be called, a News and Information Council, is the way to go for less serious breaches, either corrections or even less than corrections, just a chance in the name of democracy for the person with the grievance to have their point of view heard in the paper or on the radio or whatever. And then for the more serious ones, the court cases that we now have scope for in defamation and so on. So I actually, what I think is a great, the media represent concentrated power in our society. The differences between media are no longer as important as they once were, and the regulations grew up by historical accident anyway. And it is time now to guarantee better access of the citizenry to easy correction or easy points of debate across all the media, and for the more important breaches, whether they're malevolent or whatever, to be heard in the usual legal way. So I think I'm more or less on your side of this.
I would agree with Rod, but I would only add that I think in practice, Tim, you're asking, should there be a difference between the press and broadcast?
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, and I think in practice, it's very difficult to look at it will be very difficult to look at a lot of the impact of a lot of complaints without actually putting it within one body. Because I'll just give another example from my climate change research. That is that something may come out in the Herald Sun, it'll be syndicated across 3 or 4 News Limited publications. It will then transfer over to the talkback radio, not necessarily the same company, but it could well be another company, go up on Andrew Bott's blog, go up on other blogs and sort of recirculate through the television. And so in practice, in looking at complaints, I think it's getting increasingly difficult for anyone to pretend it's not version anyway. On, you know, you only have to look at Fairfax and they're broadcasting Channel 10 news every day. And so I think it's the only way to go, actually.
Just briefly, of course, there is an important distinction that the broadcast TV, radio rely on spectrum. The government is in charge of the spectrum, it sells it. You need a license to be a broadcaster. The difference is that standards, including privacy respect, for broadcasters and television are set by the Australian Communications Media Authority, and it's a co-regulatory scheme. But the government agency does have power to pull the licence at the end of the day. Never happened, but theoretically it's got that power. Newspapers, you don't need a licence to start a newspaper, and then we've got in the middle of all this, of course, the online world, which is, in these terms of reference, we're struggling to see how that fits into this framework. But I think Professor Disney is talking about something of that kind, that there would be some common linkage across different media for some things.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because whenever you use the word licensing, the L word, in regulatory context, and particularly when you're talking to people who are very close to journalism, or who work in journalism, that's kind of like a red rag to a bull, that word. And so, if you were to have a mechanism which has some teeth, you'd have to think about how you actually structure that, and licensing is one way. So, yeah, I can see that there's a huge shit fight basically ahead of us because of that tension.
Couldn't the, sorry, I'm sure we won't move on to the question, but couldn't the complaints mechanism be moved outside the ACMA and the licensing provision? Because I think you're right, Tim, the whole idea of licensing journalists would undoubtedly be used to exclude some, particularly the ones who are more distant, maybe more critical. Well, that's the fear anyway, it always will be the fear.
Yeah, I think removal of licensing is saying, well, we have one punishment, capital punishment, and we all know it's never going to be used. And I think graduated punishments, financial or other. And I would like to actually see most of these things resolved without punishments of that sort anyway.
We've spoken a lot about diversity in media, but one of the big issues is how we deal with the fact that News Limited is able to cross-subsidise. So a lot of the one newspaper towns, for instance, like Brisbane, Darwin, that it's just a News Limited paper. How would we go about dealing with the ability of News Limited to cross-subsidise between their different newspapers without breaking up News Limited, which would obviously cost the government billions of dollars?
I don't think anyone's talking about breaking up News Limited.
Sorry, did you just say break up News Limited? Because the way I'm going to edit the video, you... Sorry.
Gotcha.
Yeah, no, look, I think, I love News Limited, but politically it's impossible. And in principle, it would be a very dangerous precedent to actually do it. And one of the problems we come across is exactly the one you mentioned, that while we might sort of say when News Limited has too much Australian circulation, even if we said, well, you've got to give up the Courier Mail, they would still have the monopoly in Adelaide. And how to actually get competing newspapers, especially in the outside Melbourne, Sydney, given the decline of newspapers, is a central conundrum. And I agree, News Limited is our biggest single problem, but I can't see that there's going to be any possible policy way of breaking up News Limited in the foreseeable future?
In fact, I think actually almost apart from the standards and the issues before the inquiry, there's a bigger crisis, could be a potential even bigger crisis, because if in fact the Murdoch empire sort of shifts, in terms of who's in control, they may well decide that, the Australian end of it is not so important after all. And it's quite likely if the Hobart Mercury, for example, went up for sale, there might not be a buyer. And so because of the fact, through lack of action over previous decades, we've ended up in this pretty bad situation, that it could actually end up with whole communities not really having access even to what they've got at the minute. And so I think there's a need for some sort of vision actually for what could happen in the future with the media, apart from just the issues of regulation. And I do think that there is a potential here to argue for some strengthening. And I think that they're open to that, some strengthening, at least some community media, some sorts of regional and rural media is something I'm particularly in favour of.
In terms of reference B, I think is the opportunity really for that sort of argument.
Okay, so we have a question, gentleman in the back row.
My name's Paul. I work for a progressive advocacy group called the Vars. My question really builds off that one. Basically, I wanted to invite the speakers to talk a little bit more about what that vision is, because we've acknowledged that concentration of ownership is a huge problem in the Australian context, but also it's the policy problem that no one really knows how to solve, and talk of breaking up News Limited is politically impossible and potentially actually it would have a negative effect on democracy with newspapers closing down and so on. Is there a way? I mean, we've had cross-media ownership laws in the past, which are now so watered down and so out of date that they don't really mean very much. Is there a way that we can, Wendy, you brought up support mechanisms and so on, is there also a way that we can perhaps legislate or set in place a policy which recognises the status quo, but tries to stop further concentration of media ownership in Australia, which is a potential risk